The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr Chairman, I got to say I don't share the total enthusiasm that my New Zealand First colleague does for commending the government on this one. I want to deal, sir, with the child support matters and place on record that the government will support the bill. There is an issue in Part 4 which the opposition will support the bill. There's an issue in Part 4 which we'll come to. But in terms of the child support issue, I think what the New Zealand First colleague neglected to mention, of course, is it is true that Mr Macleay, who is the IRD Minister and presumably will be vociferously answering all the questions we put to him today, sir, did pick up a steamy political issue, shall we say, if I can put it delicately, sir, for your sensibilities, from his former Minister Peter Dunn. And to put it bluntly, he inherited a major cost blowout. As my colleague Grant Robertson has said, this was costed originally at 30 million. Then it blew out the estimate at that was in 2011. 2014, the estimate blew out to 210. And then I think, to give credit to Mr Macleay, I think he must have hauled in the officials and got down on bended knee and begged them to do something creative, to phase it, to do something to smooth the books so that the mountain of budget blowout would go down to around 163 million. But of course the balance is in suspended animation, sir. It's yet to come as it's phased in. The point being is that if we are asking liable parents to be accountable for the expenditures and to be accountable and ensure that they pay their way for the family members for their family members, and to be accountable and chase them up, sir, then I would have thought it would have been on principle pretty realistic to expect the government in the form of the Minister and the Chair, who is not the Portfolio Minister with respect, but the IRD Minister, either former or present, to provide us with some sort of explanation as to why, particularly Mr Dunn, was asleep at the wheel. When a department comes to you and they have not factored in CapEx, then anybody, I would have thought, sir, with half a brain, awake behind the ministerial desk, would have said, now hang on, are we sure there's not a CapEx component in this? Well, Mr Dunn just sort of floated along, and when he relinquished, I think he is the longest serving Revenue Minister in any Commonwealth Parliament within the Commonwealth, sir. That is some sort of record, dubious though it may be. But you would have thought, with that wealth of experience, well, I stand to be corrected, wealth of experience, that Mr Dunn, when presented with a project like this, on the back of course, the business transformation project, where the money is just flowing like the Nile River, just flowing out the door, you know, breaking in the sheaves, as it were, to use the biblical expression, he would have, sir, said, now hang on, have we got the figures right? Because we know with these sorts of processes, sir, there are always, you know, movements and cost. But to sit there blindly, sir, and not even ask the question in respect to CapEx, and then the department's got to paper over the cracks, is astounding. Mr Macleay, of course, then inherits it and tries to sort of fix it up. But I would have thought, for those liable parents and others sitting at home who are expected, and they should, pay their bills, pay their way, look after their family, I would have thought that those parents would be sitting back saying, well, if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for the government who expends this money on our behalf to be at least half awake and to ensure that these blowouts don't occur. But to date, sir, we've had zero explanation in any stage through this bill. I see the Minister and the Chair has changed again, not to, with respect, the Portfolio Minister. We've had no explanation and no accountability. The previous Minister just wrung his hands and said, well, I'm not there now, game over, and passed the baton to Mr Macleay, and he's been relatively silent, if not totally silent, on the matter, sir. But I am interested, as Grant Robertson said, in clause 44, because it harks back where the Commissioner is given discretion to look at other appropriate mechanisms and payment methods in respect of liable parent contribution. It harks back to a previous tax bill that Michael Cullen, I recall, introduced. Similar principle, where if a small business, sir, had a difficulty, there was a mistake in GST or income tax or whatever, in the old days the penalties and interest would flow, as I say, like the Nile. and a mountain of debt and a mountain of penalties would be put upon those small business people. Now some, okay, may have cooked the books. Most, 90% I'd argue, were an innocent mistake has been made. And we changed the law to allow, once an intervention was called for, everything froze. And then you could examine it in a logical way and deal with it. So I do support this measure because Mr Chair, I do support this measure because, as Grant Robertson has said, and all of us who've dealt with folks on both sides of the equation in respect of child support, it is an extremely difficult position. And to be fair, the IRD, they are only the referee, and they only intervene, in theory, when there is a dislocation or where agreement cannot be reached. And they have to, they have to deal with this in a formulaic way. And that in itself is inflexible, but there are no better ways. That itself is inflexible and doesn't allow for a whole lot of the subtleties and nuances that we see within the liable parent, caring parent relationship. I think this clause, to be fair, goes some way to looking at those issues. Where you've got, is it $3 billion worth of outstanding payments, and as Mr Robertson said, 75% being penalties, the system obviously is not working. Obviously what the state wants is they want the parents to ensure that those children are looked after. They are, irrespective of relationship breakdown, they are the responsibility of the biological parents, and they should be catered for. And in good grace, I'd argue that most Kiwi parents would do that regardless of whether we had an IRD mechanism or mechanisms such as this. But there are difficulties in relationships, as we know. There are disagreements. There are all sorts of leverage occasionally that certain partners try and put upon others. It's called life. There's a whole representative set of issues, and at that point the state, in its own inimitable way, has to intervene. And if one can build in some flexibility like this clause, sir, where mechanisms, where you can look at other methods to ensure that that money gets to where it's supposed to be going and ensure that those liable parents are accountable without burying them as we have under a mountain of debt, but ensuring they meet their responsibilities, that has to be the #1 priority. But basically ensuring the system works, then I think this is something, sir, that common sense would say one should support. But I do go back, sir, to the costs around this. It appears, and it worries me, that there appears since the retirement of some very, very venerable IRD officials. I went to Robin Oliver's, the trust that's launched in Robin Oliver's name, the awards last week, sir. Very venerable official. He's not the only one. They're very experienced officials in IRD that have now retired. It does worry me that we're getting, these sort of mistakes flowing through. Go back a year or two, we had the computer issue, the car parks issue. Again, Mr Dunn was in charge of that. There's two things that concern me. One, that a minister should be on top of their game, especially if they're in the Guinness Book of Records for being the longest serving revenue minister in our history. But secondly, ministers have to be on top of their game and read the papers. And when stuff comes through and up on a minister's desk that doesn't add up, they need the presence of mind to shoot it down. Secondly, sir, it does concern me that some of that long-term policy advice and experience that we've had for many, many years, that is no longer there now. It worries me that the quality and high level of advice may be depleted. There are things that one would have expected would not make a minister's desk, ideas that would not make a minister's desk, because as we've shown in the past, sir, they have not added up. And finally, sir, the concern with the cost blowout flows across the business transformation project. And again, and I did say this to the IRD Commissioner at a function the other night, we want the IRD to work, we want the system to be the best in the world, but we also, because we've been through INSIS and other IT blowouts throughout our history, we want to know that those collecting the money especially are also accountable for its expenditure and are treating the expenditures of public monies as if they were their own, and being as accurate and detailed and focused on ensuring that those expenditures are executed correctly. Because it seems to me we haven't had the explanations to justify this blowout. That would suggest that we're not likely to get the explanations to reassure us that the expenditure around the business transformation program is warranted. And that leads to questioning the whole setup, sir. We want to have confidence in this. A good tax system must be simple, it must be clear for people, and people must be confident in it. And it's the confidence in it, and the confidence especially in terms of those who are collecting money being accountable for its expenditure within their own department, and ministers on top of that regime, that we will be focusing on and monitoring very closely, sir, even outside the parameters of this bill as it proceeds. So, sir, we support the bill and we look forward to some answers to the questions.
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much.